So good evening to everyone, and welcome. My name is Mark Michael. I'm a professor of sociology and Middle Eastern studies here at NYU. And I wanted to thank you all for coming tonight. Some of you have come a long way. I've heard there are even some people coming all the way from Dubai on behalf of the Institute. And I also wanted to thank the Institute for organizing this wonderful event. So tonight we're going to be, I'm going to try to, because you're lucky, I'm going to try to keep this short and sweet because you're not here to listen to me. We're also lucky to have Professor Massad, Joseph Massad with us tonight, who graciously agreed to come and talk to us about his latest book. We're lucky not only because of his fame within the field of Arab intellectual history and politics, nor because of his prestigious and to some enviable position at Columbia University, not because of the stellar productivity he seems intent on flaunting around. He has only published 4 books on a very narrow range of topics. The first, Colonial Effects, unearthed the effects of legal and military institutions on the formation of Jordanian national identity and national culture. The second, The Persistence of the Palestinian Question, was a major contributor to recasting the Palestinian conflict as the continuation of European settler colonialism and imperialism. A short version of that book came out in French. The third, Desiring Arabs, took to task the imperial nature of the contemporary Euro-American discourses on sexuality and its internalization by Arab generations of intellectuals from the 19th century to the present. The book became an instant classic, winning the 2008 Lionel Trilling Book Award, and beyond academia had a huge influence within the world of NGOs, public health organizations, and human rights activism, amongst others. Today, it has become the major reference for all scholarship on the question of desire and sex in the post-colonial world. And the most recent book, Islam and Liberalism, deals with the minor question of the mutual constitution of Islam and liberalism over the past, 300 years? So nothing to write home about or turn green from, really, quite apart from the 100 of articles in academic and broadsheet publications. We could just be happy to have Joseph here tonight because he's a very busy man who gets to give an average of a keynote a week. Or we could be happy that his latest book, Islam and Liberalism, just came out a month ago, making us the first or second university where he has delivered a talk about it. Keeping NYU, Abu Dhabi at the cutting edge of global intellectual debates. Personally, I'm happy to see him here tonight because he's a friend, a wonderful speaker, and most importantly, one of the sharpest, wittiest, and most courageous and outrageous persons I've ever met. His uncompromising attitude towards Zionism in public and private contexts alike has been exemplary to us all, particularly at a time of US and global history when Arabs and Islam have been persecuted and demonized relentlessly, within and without academic contexts. From the Homeland Security Act to Daniel Pipe's Pipe Dream, Campus Watch, academics in the US have been subjected to a wave of intimidation and silencing worthy of the McCarthy era on the subject of Islam and Palestine in particular. Today, Joseph is probably the only intellectual in a major US university to display such overt anti-Zionist policies, apart from Judith Butler. And he has, over the years, had to pay a dear price for it. This new book is particularly timely, not only because of its intellectual contribution to the debates on the history of liberalism, but also because of its political relevance at a critical junction, the post-Charlie Hebdo events in France, where European Islamophobia threatens to follow the American model we have unfortunately become accustomed to in the years following 9/11, and with the consequences that we've also had a chance to take a full measure of firsthand from our desert vantage point. So it is with great pride and pleasure that I ask you to join me in welcoming Joseph Massad tonight.
Thank you very much for this very generous and funny introduction. I'm ecstatic to be here in Abu Dhabi. This is my first time here. I've been once before to Dubai, but I've never been to Abu Dhabi. It's a great honor to be here, and I'd like to thank NYU Abu Dhabi and the Institute for hosting me and inviting me. And thank you all for making the time to come and attend. The lecture this evening is based on my recent book, Islam and Liberalism, which is sort of a first volume of a two-volume project that I've been working on. In fact, the entire book was supposed to be the introduction to my forthcoming book, but it turned out to be too large to be just an introduction and became a book unto itself. Islam is at the heart of liberalism, at the heart of Europe. It was there at the moment of the birth of liberalism and the birth of Europe. Islam is indeed the condition of their emergence as the identities they claim to be. Islam, as I will show this evening, resides inside liberalism, defining its identity and its very claims of difference. It is an internal constituent of liberalism, not merely an external other, though liberalism often projects it as the latter. The establishment of differing forms of liberalism as the reigning political, social, and/or economic system in parts of Western Europe and the United States since the late 18th century, and its main deployment thenceforward as the ideological weapon of choice against the internal and external others of Europe, is what marks its current legitimation as a global ideological system. Europe's external others have historically included Orientals and the Orient, Muslims and Islam, Africa and Africans, Oriental despotisms of various kinds extending from East to West Asia, and everything in between. Liberal Europe's internal others, however, include Orthodox and Catholic Christians and their form of Christianity, Jews and Judaism, fascism, anarchism, and communism. The situation following the collapse of the Soviet Union, the last state-sponsored threat to liberalism within Europe, is astutely described by Tula Nikolakopoulos in the following terms. I quote her. Today, Anglophone political philosophy is generally conducted in the light of the perceived triumph of liberalism. That is, it typically proceeds on the assumption that it is unreasonable, if not irrational or pathological, to resist liberalism, whether as a mode of thought or as a social order. End of quote. The hegemony of liberalism, she continues, is such that to resist it, she says, quote, would be unreasonably to deny the moral and or political superiority of the values governing liberal societies as compared with their historical and contemporary social alternatives, unquote. Alasdair MacIntyre, writes Gerald Gauss, one of his important acolytes, poses the question, and I quote, Nietzsche or Aristotle? If I am right, Gauss affirms, and I quote him, the question is Nietzsche or liberalism. And unless one is a psychopath, the answer must be the latter, unquote. In its constitution of an Islam that it names and wants to oppose, contemporary Western liberalism offers the more detrimental choice, liberalism or Islam, or variations therein, liberalism or totalitarian Islamism, liberalism or Islamofascism, liberalism or Islamic despotism, liberalism, and so forth. I mean, the correlate, basically, to Gauss's question here would be that unless one is a barbarian, a despot, an irrational psychopath, a neurotic, a totalitarian, an intolerant brute, a misogynist, a homophobe, in short, a Muslim, the answer must be the latter. In this context, political theorist Paul Kahn paraphrases Americans' view of themselves and the world at large as follows. Let me quote him a bit. He says, our contemporary missionaries preach democracy, free markets, and the rule of law, all institutions founded on our belief in the equality and liberty of every person. This dogged commitment to a universal community is a product of both our Christian and Enlightenment traditions. We experience this commitment simultaneously as a kind of open-ended love and as a faith in the capacity of each individual to enter a national debate that will result in mutual agreement. No one, we believe, as Americans, he says, is beyond conversion to our values. When we dream of a global order, we project our own values onto it. We do not imagine that the global community of the future will be led by an Islamic cleric, unquote. American and European missionaries of liberalism, i.e. those who imagine that the global community of the future will be led by a secular cleric, seek to proselytize their value system and model of social and political order to all Muslims whom they seek to save and rescue from their despotic system of rule, failing which the missionaries would at least want to rescue Muslim women and increasingly male and female, though less attention is paid to the latter, male and female Muslim homosexuals from Islam's misogyny, homophobia, and intolerance. This act of proselytization aims to convert Muslims and Islam to Western liberalism and its value system as the only just and sane system to which the entire planet must be converted. Muslim resistance to this benevolent mission is represented as a rejection of modernity and the liberal values of freedom, liberty, equality, the right-bearing individual, democratic citizenship, women's rights, sexual rights, freedom of belief, secularism, rationality, etc. You get the picture. In short, as a pathology and a form of neurosis that must not only be vanquished, but also, as the recent literature on psychoanalysis and Islam insists, must be psychoanalyzed. Thus, if Muslims refuse to convert willingly to liberalism, or at least to forms of Islam that liberalism finds tolerable, then they must be forced to convert using military power. Their resistance threatens a core value of liberalism, namely its universality and the necessity of its universalization. The more robust recent campaign to identify Islam as the last holdout resisting Western liberalism is significant on a number of fronts, not least of which is the deployment of the referent Islam itself. The very naming of that which resists liberalism's universalization as Islam is fraught with political and definitional problems that are not easily surmountable. One of the difficulties in analyzing what Islam has come to mean and to refer to since the 19th century is the absence of agreement on what Islam actually is. Does Islam name a religion, a geographical site, a communal identity? Is it a concept, a technical term, a sign, or a taxonomy? The lack of clarity on whether it could be all these things at the same time is compounded by the fact that Islam has acquired reference and significations it did not formerly possess. European Orientalists and Muslims and Arab thinkers have begun to use Islam in numerous ways while seemingly convinced that it possesses an immediate intelligibility that requires no specification or definition. Islam, for these thinkers, is not only the name the Quran attributes to the deen, often mistranslated as religion into English, that the Quran attributes to the deen that entails a faith in God disseminated by the Prophet Muhammad, but can also refer to the history of Muslim states and empires, the different bodies of philosophical, theological, jurisprudential, medical, literary, and scientific works, as well as to culinary, sexual, social, economic, religious, ritualistic, and scholarly, agricultural, and urban practices engaged in by Muslims from the 7th century to the 19th and beyond, as well as much, much more. Some of the new meanings and reference of Islam had a significant impact on political and social thought, as well as on national and international politics in the 19th and 20th centuries, and may have even more of an impact in the 21st. The implication of these meanings for politics and society results from their transformation of Islam into a culture, thaqafa, or a civilization, hadara, or a cultural tradition, a system, a manhaj, a way of life, a method, a program, an ethics, even a code of public conduct, a gendered sartorial code, even a set of banking principles, a type of governance. Moreover, Islam has also come to be deployed as a metonym. Fiqh, which is usually translated problematically as jurisprudence, and kalam, sometimes translated as theology, also problematically. So both fiqh and kalam, which were traditionally sciences established by Muslim thinkers, and sharia, often mistranslated as law, a term, of course, loaded with different connotations and trajectories, often referring to a body of opinions and interpretations, all of them come to be conceived as constituent parts of Islam for which it can metonymically substitute. While the easiest transformation to identify is the one that makes Islam over into a culture and a civilization, given the centrality of this meaning among Orientalist thinkers and their Muslim and Arab counterparts since the 19th century, the production of Islam's many other new meanings and reference may not be as clear. Yet a history of the multiplication of the meanings of Islam is necessary for understanding what Islam has become in today's world, both in those parts of the world where peoples as well as political and social forces claim to uphold one kind of Islam or another, and in those parts of the world where peoples as well as political and social forces see Islam as other, whether or not they oppose it. Indeed, the current ongoing war among the many forces that claim to speak in the name of Islam and in the name of anti-Islam is itself not only part of the productive process of endowing Islam with new meanings and reference, but also part of the related process of controlling the slippage of the term toward specific and particular meanings and reference and away from others. I'll give you a few examples. In this way, Islam is being opposed to certain antonyms, such as Christianity, the West, liberalism, individualism, democracy, freedom, citizenship, secularism, rationality, tolerance, human rights, women's rights, sexual rights, and decidedly, it is not opposed to others, and which it is often, or with which it is often identified, such as oppression, repression, despotism, totalitarianism, subjection, injustice, intolerance, irrationalism, cruelty, misogyny, and homophobia. Two central religious and intellectual strands emerged in the 19th century among Arab, Muslim, and European Orientalist thinkers who argued for the compatibility or incompatibility of Islam with Western modernity and progress. The word, or more precisely, the name, Islam, itself began to conjure up immediate comprehension and significance in ways assumed to have always been the case. This project of rethinking Islam or rethinking about Islam in new ways, while often passing itself off as a return to old or original ways of thinking, was situated in the political context of the rise of European imperial thought and territorial expansion, as well as in the corresponding decline of the Ottoman political and imperial power. Yet, the Islam to which these European and non-European thinkers referred was a more expansive concept, encompassing phenomena that had hitherto been seen as extraneous to it. Indeed, Islam had never been the catch-all term the 18th and especially the 19th century would make of it, but was rather something more specific, more particular. Another of the more interesting aspects of post-19th century uses of the term Islam is not just its accretion of reference, nor that the accreted meanings were deployed by different thinkers or different intellectual or political trends, but that they were employed differently by each thinker and each trend. European Orientalists, Arab secularists, Muslim and Christian, pious and later Islamist thinkers, post-colonial states defining themselves as Muslim or Islamic, and their Western and secular opponents, all seem to use the term Islam in a variety of ways to refer to a whole range of things. The productive multiplication of reference that Islam would begin to acquire would ultimately destabilize whatever meaning it had had before or even after this transformation. In that, in modern writing about Islam, it is not always clear which referent it has in a given text. Rather, it often seems that all of them are in play interchangeably in the same text as well as across texts, thus rendering Islam what the science of logic calls a catachresis that always stands in for the wrong referent. it is at the site of the translation of Islam that this becomes significant for the Western liberal project. Let me just discuss a bit the problematics of translation. One often thinks of translation as opening up access to texts in other languages, a process by which one produces literal copies of an original text, albeit rendered through a different communicative medium. This optimistic, one would say, vernacular view of translation as linguistic equivalence has been complicated by myriad theories of language, linguistics, or even earlier on in philological approaches. Still, translation in the publishing industry remains mostly seen as opening doors for one language group to another, universalizing a particular language beyond its structural confines, the limitations of which were explored by Pascal Casanova in her discussion of what she calls the World Republic of Letters. But beyond the publishing industry and the profit motive, one of the most interesting uses of translation is ideological. The US government and subsidiary NGOs and private foundations rushed to fund all kinds of translation projects from English to Arabic in the wake of September 11th. This was not a new project, as US interest in the translation projects in Muslim-majority countries goes back to the dawn of the Cold War. The idea is that translation would bring about a cultural transformation in Arab and Muslim countries where Al-Qaeda-style cultures are said to prosper. Nonetheless, these translational efforts acknowledge that there are certain conceptual limitations to the common understanding of translation as an automatic rendering of one language into another, including the dilemma presented by certain words that are judged as untranslatable and that they must be adopted in their original form in the new language to which they were intended to be translated. Examples between English and French include idioms with culturally specific conceptual histories like joie de vivre, weekend, gourmet, leader, femme fatale, or chic, as in the fashionable meaning of chic, among others. In more recent years, one observes an insistence on not translating certain Arabic words to English and on rendering them in the original. These include secular words like intifada, words that carry secular and religious meanings, like chic, this time meaning sheikh and not chic in the French sense, and words identified as Islamic, most prominently Allah and jihad, and sometimes hijab and sharia. Allah, an Arabic word meaning God that was used by Arab Christians and non-Christians before the Quranic revelation, is rendered in English and other European accounts as the proper name of the God of the Muslims, even though the Prophet Muhammad's father was named Abdullah, or worshipper of God, long before his son was born or became a prophet. I always have a sort of investment in writing an article in Arabic about sort of American Christians, and I would say in Arabic, for example, that American Christians يعبدون إلههم God. Or to say about French Christians, French Christians يعبدون إلههم Dieu. And it's the absurdity, of course, of that invocation is, I guess, communicated now to you. Jihad, a common name among Christian Arabs, including among Lebanese Maronites, with the secular meaning of struggle, is used in the original in English and juxtaposed to the translation of Holy War, or translation Holy War. Anxiety about the meanings of words identified as Islamic was such that it became key to American investigators looking into the causes of the Egypt Air Flight 990 crash of 1999 off the US East Coast, as the Egyptian pilot's use of the normative invocation, Tawakkaltu ala Allah, often translated as, I put my trust in God, became key to attributing suspicious motives to him. Moreover, the Western media and Western officialdom expended special time in order to understand the word hudna and its Islamic implications when Hamas offered a mere ceasefire to Israel a few years ago. It seems here that the problem may lie less with comparative translations than with comparative untranslatability. Is there an essential arbitrariness to why one word versus another would be left untranslated? Or is there a way in which we understand the word's resistance to translation? And if so, how? For something like gourmet, there is a general sense that it signifies Frenchness, in such a way that its link to French carries over, i.e. French culture and French food, which makes it make sense not to be able to translate it. This, of course, is pure fiction. But if it were the case, then how would such a fantasy of cultural essence and linguistic rootedness compare in the case, say, of intifada or sheikh, again, as sheikh, let alone jihad? Again, if the more specific question is something to the effect of how to think about comparative untranslatability, then the larger question is how to think about the untranslated and the untranslatable. Is the untranslatable being acknowledged as respect for difference and as a limit to narration, or is it an emphasis on othering and exoticization? What about words that have religious significance? Ismail Raji al-Farouqi, a religious Muslim American of Palestinian origin, suggested that many such words are in fact not translatable. He provides the example of how the Arabic Quranic word salah, which refers to a set of rituals repeated 5 times a day by observant Muslims, and which include a set of recitations, genuflections, prostrations, standings, and sittings with orientation towards the Kaaba, and should be entered into after ablutions and the solemn declaration of intention, that this word, salah, is mistranslated to English as prayer, when in fact, the forms that varying Christian prayers take are more akin to what Muslims call dua or ibtihal than to salah. Other examples al-Farouqi provides include zakah, which is mistranslated as charity or almsgiving. He concludes that as such a word has no equivalent in English, and I quote him, it must therefore never be translated. Rather, it must be understood as it stands in its Arabic original. For al-Farouqi, whose interest is that Muslims who are native speakers of English understand their religion correctly and accurately, and learn the wide range of meanings Quranic words have in Arabic, giving such words English terms through translation would be, quote, to reduce and often to ruin those meanings, unquote. In the academic realm, Wael Hallaq has argued that the very mistranslation or translation of Sharia into law has been detrimental to the way Orientalists understood and judged it, and how they and Muslim modernists sought to transform it. These are hardly new translational preoccupations. Orientalists themselves have dabbled in a variety of ethnographic translations whose difficulty they identified and whose etymological implications some of them fantasized, perhaps the most infamous of which is Bernard Lewis's charlatanism in excavating the word thawra, meaning revolution, which he linked to the rising of camels. Edward Said put it thus in his 1981 book covering Islam. I quote him. The term Islam as it is used today seems to mean, and this is in 1981, seems to mean one simple thing, but in fact is part fiction, part ideological label, part minimal designation of a religion called Islam. In no really significant way is there a direct correspondence between the Islam in common Western usage and the enormously varied life that goes on within the world of Islam with its more than 800 million people back in 1981. Its millions of square miles of territory, principally in Africa and Asia, its dozens of societies, states, histories, geographies, and cultures, unquote. What is it then about Islam? What is at stake in translating it, and what is identified as its subsidiary vocabulary to English and other European languages? Some scholars argue that in the modern era, Islam, like the Orient, is another antonym for the West, while others have argued that European secularism is its proper opposite. Yet others speak of democracy, civilization, and freedom as the opposites of this Islam. Indeed, a Washington Post veteran journalist went as far as positing the English language itself as the antonym of Islam when she described the outcome of a Qatari school curricular reform as, quote, less Islam, more English, unquote. It seems, therefore, that as the referents of Islam have multiplied, so have its antonyms. The question then becomes whether the production of Islam's many new referents was part of the same translational process of producing its many new antonyms, from being a singular Christendom or Christianity to many more opposites. I should note here that the Western and Orientalist deployment of Christianity and Christendom themselves as singular is based on a retrospective deployment of a unitary community on what was historically disunited peoples, doctrines, and churches. A number of scholars of religion agree that the development of the multiple significations of Islam after the colonial encounter was greatly conditioned by it. Leonard Binder sketches Western imperial liberalism's efforts at conversion of Islam into a form liberalism can accept. He asserts, and I quote him, that from the time of the Napoleonic invasion, from the time of the Janissaries, from the time of the Sepoy Mutiny, at least, the West has been trying to tell Islam what must be the price of progress in the coin of tradition, which is to be surrendered. And from those times, despite the increasing numbers of responsive Muslims, there remains a substantial number that steadfastly argue that it is possible to progress without paying such a heavy cultural price, unquote. In response to Binder, Talal Asad maintains that it is, and I quote him, that it is no incidental detail that each of these alleged tellings when the West was telling Islam what to do, each of these tellings cited by Binder, when traditional authority was successfully attacked in the name of rationalism and progress, each of them was at the same time an act of violence. In each of them, Western political, economic, and ideological power increased its hold over non-European peoples. That power, unleashed in Enlightenment Europe, continues to restructure the lives of non-European peoples, often through the agency of non-Europeans themselves. And if whatever is called Islamic fundamentalism is a response to that power, then certainly so, even more thoroughly, are the intellectual currents calling themselves modernist Islam, which is concerned to adapt theology to the models of Christian modernism, or even Muslim secularism, which the proponents of which are preoccupied less with theology than with separating religion from politics and national life. And so too are the progressivist movements in literature and the arts, in politics and law that have arisen in Muslim societies. All of them, not only Islamic fundamentalism, have been in response to these European important sort of moments of violence. Given these deep entanglements, how did Islam become so central to liberalism as ideology and as identity? Indeed, how has liberalism, representing itself as the antithesis of Islam, become the very discourse through which Europe as a modern identity was conjured up? Edward Said's famous book, Orientalism, has clarified how in the process of identification, the emergence of Europe was predicated on a series of projections, disavowals, displacements, and expulsions in order to produce a coherent self cleansed of others to which this self was opposed in its very constitution. That the Orient and Orientals, Semites and Semitism, and specifically Islam and Muslims would constitute a primary other that was internal to this Europe and which had to be expelled from its emergent formation is now uniformly accepted in scholarship. The intellectual and political histories within which Islam operates as a category of Western liberalism demonstrate how projection is central to this process as well. The anxieties about what this Europe constituted and constitutes at various periods of its history, despotism, intolerance, misogyny, and homophobia, all of these European traits were projected onto Islam, and that only through this projection could Europe emerge as democratic, tolerant, misophilic, and homophilic. In short, Islam free. Once Europe is produced as this paradisiacal place, it becomes incumbent upon Christian and liberal Europeans not only to proselytize their new religion, dubbed as culture and a mode of living, but also to save and rescue non-Europeans from their anti- and un-European cultures and modes of life. The history of liberalism since Montesquieu, at least, who, by the way, coined the term Oriental despotism, and of European regimes since before the French Revolution, when Europe identified what it called the Eastern Question in its pursuit of subduing the Ottoman Empire, has been an incremental manifestation of a Christian and liberal zealotry of missionizing certain forms of superiority under the principal banner of democracy. This project has continued with a vengeance since the beginning of the 21st century and has already cost millions of lives. The emergence of the Eastern Question in 18th century Western Europe, which is again how varying European attempts to conquer the Ottoman Empire defined themselves, it would become essential for the European project that will be called in the 19th century civilization and culture. As such, the Eastern Question against which this nascent Europe measured itself was always the Western Question, the question of constituting the West as the West and the East as its antithesis. That the Eastern Question would also become the question of Islam and therefore the question of Protestant Christianity would be germane to the European liberal project of presenting the West as a place with important characteristics that are always lacking in its Eastern and Islamic antitheses. This will be key to understanding how the projects named democracy and more recently women's liberation or sexual rights would become a core value of European liberalism and a central lack in Islam. In contrast to Protestant Christianity, capitalism or modernity, which are often claimed by liberal thinkers as enablers of democracy, women's and sexual rights, Islam has been said to be either fully fortified or defenseless against this Western political order. US President George W. Bush was clear on the Christian origins of freedom when he declared in 2004, and I quote him, "Freedom is the Almighty's gift to every man and woman in this world, and as the greatest power on the face of the earth, we have an obligation to help the spread of freedom," unquote. Clearly, the offensive capability of democracy is organized by both secular and divine power simultaneously. Indeed, democracy has in certain ways become the new name of Christianity and has been missionized to the heathens in ways that are no less deadly. What is at stake in these formulations is basically how the question of a geographically and religiously mapped notion of culture has come to be related to political arrangements of governance, how Oriental cultures seem to have produced Oriental despotism, while a unitary Occidental culture produced Western democracy, in a context in which religion, specifically Islam and Christianity, as a subset or often a synonym of culture, is foregrounded as that which essentializes the East and the West. Absent from these considerations is the history of despotic European regimes that parade themselves as liberal and democratic, whether the slave system that spanned a century after the US was established, or the Jim Crow apartheid system that succeeded it for another century, let alone the various European liberal regimes that instituted indentured servitude, denied women suffrage, and instituted in the wake of the French Revolution the class distinction between active and passive citizenship. Class oppression aside, the denial of rights to the millions of colonized peoples whose lands were conquered and who were subjected to European despotic rule was carried out by regimes that identified themselves as liberal and justified by European liberal political thinkers, including John Locke, Alexis de Tocqueville, and Mill, to name the most prominent. I mean, remember, imagine, today, for example, my students at Columbia University would still repeat sort of the political mantra in the US media and the educational system and government discourse that the US is some 200-year-old democracy. So when you point out, of course, that the first century was slavery and the second century was apartheid, that women did not have the vote for 150 years, people are sort of taken aback, and you wonder, how would you then say it was a 200-year democracy unless there's a commitment to some white male supremacist understanding that these are the only people who actually had voting rights. But I mean, think of the contrast of South Africa. Imagine of white South Africans today saying, we've been a democracy since 1910. Like the US, we're an evolutionary democracy. In 1983, we included Indians and coloreds, and in 1994, we included blacks. We've always been a democracy. I mean, they'd be laughed out of the room. But it's amazing how this kind of discourse continues to be legitimized, not only by the government, but by the media and the educational system in the US. It remains most curious, though, that culturalist arguments have not been posited by either liberal imperial thinkers any more than by anti-imperialist thinkers to explain Europe's and the US's penchant for ruling despotically in the colonies, or in the case of the US, imposing and propping up despotic rulers around its imperial domain. Nor have arguments been advanced that European and American cultures are incompatible with democratic rule in their imperial domains. Indeed, when the US and Britain denied their non-propertied classes and their female citizens suffrage, let alone when they were ruled by despotic monarchical systems in the age of absolutism, or when the US operated a system of slavery and racial apartheid, no culturalist arguments were advanced to explain this grave democratic deficit among white European American property-owning Protestant Christian men either. No one said that they're incompatible with democracy. No one came up with culturalist explanations for why white European Protestants or American Protestants could not have democracy or democratic rule. This, however, has not stopped the forward march of culturalist and religious arguments about Muslim minorities living in Europe and the US, subverting the democratic cultures of both by their allegedly anti-democratic proclivities, manifested in a variety of attitudes and mechanisms, not least of which in the form of headscarves for women in social and sartorial relations, and Sharia in the realm of the juridical, manifesting most clearly in the 9/11 attacks. Perhaps the recent Charlie Hebdo situation and what's happened in Belgium and in the US illustrates some of these points. Indeed, measures in the US Congress and in state legislatures to ban Sharia law have been afoot for several years, with US presidential candidate Newt Gingrich identifying Sharia, and I quote, as a mortal threat, unquote, to the United States. Jacques Rancière, the French philosopher, has more recently identified this anti-Muslim and anti-democratic discourse in the US and Western Europe as part of what he calls the Western, and I quote, hatred of democracy. While Wendy Brown astutely described it as an unwitting neo-Orientalism on the European left, one that figures anxiety about identification with a putatively fundamentalist, theocratic, ideological, unfree other, and the many sources and the sites of unfreedom in constitutional democracies in the age of globalization, and finally with the barbarism inside Euro-Atlantic democracy and the barbarism wreaked by democracy, unquote. Might this whole recent and rejuvenated anxiety about Islam and democracy then be a projection of the West and its own failures in establishing democratic governance in its own societies and the societies it governed and governs, and not about Islam at all? And here I'm not really, largely invested in the ritual, just the electoral ritual of just going to the polls, or for, 40% of Americans or Europeans going to the polls once every 4 years as actual democracy. But assuming even that is the case, it remains inexplicable how this discourse continues to dominate. Indeed, the very suspension of certain citizenship rights of Muslims as individuals and communities in Europe and in the US, or the redefinition of citizenship as secular Christian European norm that should be imposed on Muslims, is essentially a reinforcement of the understanding of citizenship itself as a Western value that is in opposition to Muslim tradition and corrupted in the hands of Oriental Muslims and must be withdrawn from them or imposed on them as a Western construct. Think of last summer's France banning demonstrations in solidarity with Gaza, for example. This is not a new anxiety among liberal theorists. De Tocqueville seemed most concerned that the rapid increase in the number of immigrants to the US from Eastern and Southern Europe who were, quote, alien to the English race, unquote, could corrupt the democratic political culture of the country in the middle of the 19th century, putting it, and I quote, in the greatest danger. Remember, of course, the whole discourse on Catholics in the 19th and 20th century in the US and, of course, in Europe was very much also governed by these kinds of understandings that Catholics are anti-democratic, that they have a pope that is unelected. A lot of the arguments you hear about Islam were very much deployed against Catholics. Toward the end of his life, Samuel P. Huntington would also show similar concerns about the increase in the number of Mexicans and Hispanics more generally in the US and their alleged Hispanization impact on American identity, culture, and the English language, let alone the transformation of the US into what he called an unrepresentative democracy. This is then a discourse about the West as a modern category. It's despotism, it's undemocracy, and its conjuring up of an Ottoman despotism and later of Islamic undemocracy that did not exist as such before their European marking, itself a ruse for the production of European democracy. The discourse on democracy is also largely a Christian religious discourse, a Protestant Christian religious discourse, which posits democracy as the highest stage of Protestant Christianity, to paraphrase Lenin. Indeed, since the 1940s, Christianity and even Judaism have come to be defined, as a title of an interesting book published in the 1940s put it, as, quote, religions of democracy. British, French, and US, even at times Dutch and German, imperial policies included, in the case of the British and the French, since the 19th century, and of the Americans since World War II, the production of certain forms of Islam that could be put in the service of colonial and imperial policies. This involved intermittently the imperial production of liberal forms of Islam, especially in the rich colonial debates about and interventionist policies in the question of the Ottoman Caliphate. They also produced jihadist forms of Islam, and initially mobilizing Muslims inside and outside the Soviet Union against communism, an effort shared by Nazi Germany and the liberal US and its West European allies. And then again, a liberal democratic Islam, which the British promoted since the 1920s intermittently, and the Americans promote in a new form at present, wherein the very relationship of Islam to democracy from the view of American, British, and French imperialisms was being determined by these very policies. Concomitant with these policies, British, French, and American liberal political doctrine would deploy explanations of both the emergence of liberal democracy in the so-called West and the persistence of despotism in the non-West, with particular attention to and focus on Islam. Much of this is a continuation of the othering of Islam that European liberal doctrine, since its inception, relied on to articulate its key concepts of secularism, tolerance, the individual, citizenship, and democracy, which it always opposed to the alleged Oriental and specifically Arab and Islamic practices of religious authority, intolerance, the community, subjection, and despotism. Remember, a lot of liberal theory in the 19th century and even in the late 18th century would speak about how European kings were acting like Oriental despots, right? So the idea of liberal democratic order was precisely about seeing Europe as Oriental, that the problem with Europe was its Oriental nature. And the way to modernity and to liberalism is to de-Orientalize Europe. Right? The idea was that Europeans were behaving like alleged Orientals, and therefore transforming them into Occidentals was the project of modernity. So it was not really the threat from the outside, but the threat from the inside of Europe. This is not only a projection of Western liberal imperial commitments to despotism at home and abroad onto Islam and the Orient, but also to showcase Western cultural and political superiority, ushered in by the age of secularism, through a suspect claim to democratic governance that is deployed in the service of securing imperial aims in what came to be known and religiously defined as the Muslim world. As European liberalism understood its commitment to what it called and calls democracy, as a contrast and a disavowal of Oriental despotism, which it projected onto Islam and the Orient more generally, it would soon understand its and Western Christianity's treatment of women as a repudiation of Oriental religions, cultures, and traditions, which it claims subordinate women through exotic and barbaric practices. This contrast, as in the case of democracy and despotism, would promote a similar Euro-American missionary zeal of proselytizing, converting, saving, and rescuing, this time not all Muslims, which liberalism, hard as it tried, has so far failed to rescue from Islamic despotism, but specifically Muslim women from the religions, cultures, and traditions under whose yoke they live, and from their allegedly misogynistic Muslim male captors. This important mission was, as many feminist scholars have shown, deployed to limit the claims of European women to equality and to stem the increase in women's rights through the Orientalist description of European women as, quote, the luckiest in the world, and most certainly luckier than Muslim women. Western liberalism's engagement with the woman question was always an engagement with the Eastern question, which was one and the same as the Western question. Montesquieu, again, would be a key figure in the representation of women in Muslim societies as slaves to a male power, of which Christian women were said to be free, and would be echoed not only by Enlightenment-era thinkers like Mary Wollstonecraft, but all the way to contemporary white European and American liberal feminists like Susan Oken and Martha Nussbaum, among others. I should say, for example, Mary Wollstonecraft would also condemn European men for their sexist or discriminatory behavior as behaving as Oriental men, right? So the idea always was the accusation of Europeans was that they were Oriental and had to be de-Orientalized for liberal progress to be achieved. Susan Oken has famously argued that Muslim women, and I quote her, might be much better off if the culture into which they were born were either to become extinct so that its members would become integrated into the less sexist surrounding culture, presumably Western culture, or preferably to be encouraged to alter itself so as to reinforce the equality of women, at least to the degree to which this value is upheld by the majority culture, unquote. The project of a Protestant Christian feminism to liberate Native Americans, Africans, and Muslims would also be espoused by the women's movement in the US since the 19th century and in Britain with figures like Josephine Butler. Protestant missionaries like Annie Van Sommer called at the beginning of the 20th century to liberate Egyptian women from their Muslim condition in ways not very unlike those used by Susan Oken a century later. Egyptian scholar Layla Ahmed marveled at such advice. She asserted, and I quote her a bit at length, that it was never argued, for instance, even by the most ardent 19th century feminists, that European women could liberate themselves from the oppressiveness of Victorian dress only by adopting the dress of some other culture. Nor has it ever been argued, whether in Mary Wollstonecraft's day, when European women had no rights, or in our own day, and even by the most radical feminists, that because male domination and injustice to women have existed throughout the West's recorded history, that the only recourse for Western women is to abandon Western cultures and find themselves some other culture. The idea seems absurd, and yet this is routinely how the matter of improving the status of women is posed with respect to women in Arab and non-Western societies. End of quote. This liberal campaign, especially in the form of NGOs and UN policies, would also extend in the last 2 decades to issues like sexual rights, tolerance, and equality. Even therapeutic methods, specifically psychoanalysis, would be offered to cure Muslims and Islam of their un-European and un-Christian and illiberal ways. What has been unfolding since the emergence of this Western discourse on Islam and democracy, Islam and women's rights, Islam and sexual rights, and so forth, is liberalism's production of a set of political vocabulary that is central to its understanding of itself and the world around it, whereby subjection and citizenship are produced not as the compatible and complementary terms instituted by liberal European systems of governance, but as cultural, geographic, and religious antonyms through appeal to an Orientalist ontology, which in turn enables the production of despotism and democracy as irreconcilable essences that serve as a justification and casus belli for European imperialism under the sign of universalism. It is this universalist reach of Western liberalism which necessitated that Islam be a constitutive part of it at the moment of birth, as the liberal project was not only one that sought to construct a new political and social order in Europe, but of constructing it alongside an economic order that required that the newly invented Europe justify why it had to launch itself on a world scale. Therein lies the importance of why Africans and Native Americans were produced as barbarians, which the liberal order sought to annihilate and later to civilize the survivors among them. That Islam was a necessary other of European democracy and freedom was very much related to the necessity of the conquest of the Muslim world, beginning with the Ottoman and Mughal empires in the 18th century, all the way to the Arabian and Persian Gulf in the 21st, as a guarantee for the economic order that formed the basis of liberalism, something it did in the 19th century for the benefit of Britain, France, and other European imperial powers, and does today to the US and its subsidiary European allies. The problem, all along, it seems, was never with Islam, but with the way European liberalism constituted itself and with the imperial order it sought and seeks to impose on the rest of the world. Whatever Islam is or is not outside the terms of this liberal production remains irrelevant to this imperial and identitarian project. Thank you.
I want to ask you or hear your opinion about the effect of the Europe or Western trials on liberating Muslims from Islam or creating a version of liberated Islam on the interpretation of Islam by the scholars.
Yes.
Or their interpretation of theology, Sharia, because in my opinion, or what I see is a lot of modern interpretations of law or laws are a direct reaction to these efforts rather than extracted from the essence of like the actual law.
Thank you for your question. Actually, we begin to see this from the 18th century. I mean, with the first major sort of military campaigns, whether it's Russia or Britain, across sort of Muslim, whether it's India or the Ottoman Empire, we begin to see indeed an articulation of something called Islam by Western policymakers, and we begin and this term Islam. I mean, many of you probably already know, the term Islam has never been that important, right? It's only mentioned 6 times in the Quran. I mean, the term Iman has always been much more important, right? This is why the leader of Muslims is always called Amir al-Mu'mineen, not Amir al-Muslimin, for example. And nonetheless, and we don't see this plethora of references to Islam in the history of Muslims, right? We begin to see, I mean, only in the late 19th century, suddenly we begin to see titles of books with the term Islam in it. We don't have that before, except rarely. Even the term Islamic, Islami, was not really used before at all. It was probably used to describe poetry, to distinguish Jahiliyyah poetry from post-revelation poetry. But to speak of al-fiqh al-Islami would be redundant, right? Because fiqh is understood as the fiqh of Islam. So to speak of something being Islam or Islamic architecture, or Islam, all of these are all novel adjectival deployments since the late 19th century. And suddenly we have these books called Islam and Capitalism, Islam and Women, Islam and the State. Nothing, I mean, Muhammad Abdo had to respond to the attack on something European Orientalists called Islam by saying, no, Islam isn't like this, right? But this Islam was conjured up through these attacks, in fact. And we see this, of course, ongoing also through Muslims' interpretations of Islam, whether they're pious interpretations or secular impious interpretations, very much in relation to this. And I think even the adoption of the term Islam as a catch-all term was very much an outcome of this ongoing process and the impact of attacks on Muslim empires since the 18th century, and the way it affected intellectual production, which is what the current book I'm working on is about, trying to document how this transformation begins from the 18th century through now. So in that sense, absolutely. Much of what we today understand as, not, of course, not all of it, but there is a very huge trend of interpreting, of looking at certain aspects of theology or jurisprudence in reaction to these things. I mean, Layla Ahmed has already documented some 25 years ago how the so-called question of the veil or of the hijab was not a question in the Muslim world. It became a question for Europeans. That's why it became a question, or you begin to have all these theological interventions in the way that it had become, because Europe made it a question for Europe. And suddenly it became a question for Muslims for whom it had not been a question before that moment. So, yes, indeed. I mean, thank you.
I have a question regarding a term that is usually used in Western discourse. Despite, a long history of European anti-Semitism, people now talk about Judeo-Christian tradition.
Yes.
Is that a contrived term, deliberately, or evolved to exclude Islamic tradition? That's not much different than Judeo-Christian. And second, my second part of the question is the question of evolution. Do you see one day that Europeans will be talking about Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. This is very important. No, the whole dyad, Judeo-Christian, was invented basically in the late 1930s, mostly with the rise of Nazism, and became deployed after World War II for Cold War reasons. For the most part, as we know, anti-Semitism and Semitism, which begins in the 18th century, the very invention of the category of the Semite and the Aryan as philological and linguistic categories, and their transformation in the 19th century, by the late 19th century, with the development of anti-Semitism as a movement. People usually don't understand that, in fact, even though anti-Semitism as a political movement begins in the 1870s, really the crux of it begins in the 1780s when the Semite and Aryan were actually invented. But no, what happens is, of course, the discourse on Judaism, like the discourse on Catholicism in the 19th century, was such that, of course, you had also modernist Jews who wanted to modernize Judaism. Indeed, the famous movement, the German and American Jewish movement called Reform Judaism, attempted to transform Judaism into something that Protestantism can tolerate, right? They began to build synagogues that looked like churches with stained glass and what have you. They began to introduce musical instruments. Indeed, Reform Judaism adopted Sunday as the day of prayer, eliminated kosher, and insisted also that boys should not be circumcised. Later on, it would reinstitute circumcision and the Sabbath, Saturday, but it adopted sort of the Protestant idea of an invention of something called religion, where basically you pray to God once a week in some structure, and you have a private relationship to the divine. So by the time you get to the mid-20th century, of course, the majority of American Jews are in fact Reform Jews, not Orthodox, unlike in Israel. So they actually followed this thing, and they had, historically been interested in this Christianizing mission, initially also by a group of intellectuals, Jewish intellectuals, called Maskilim in the Haskalah, or the Jewish Enlightenment, which reacted to European anti-Jewishness and anti-Semitism, not unlike the Arab Nahda, and Muslims reacted basically by adopting and internalizing so much of the critique that indeed we must become like them because they are the civilized. And so it is once Reform Judaism shed all the Jewish parts that offended Protestant Christianity and secularism, was it welcome as part of the diet. As we know, of course, Orthodox Jews are appalled at this Judeo-Christian tradition. After all, Christian tradition was based on the nullification and the cancellation of the Jewish tradition, on redefining it. So it is not at all sort of a combined tradition in that sense. So yes, so now on the yes, if enough Muslims and Islamic theologians transform at least one form or several forms of Islam into some religion that Protestant Christianity and liberalism can tolerate, rest assured it will be added to the Judeo-Christian Islamic ethical system. Thank you.
You carried us through several discourses, and you kind of subverted these notions of hegemonic discourses in terms of Islam and these negative reference. What I'm interested in is this. How do we develop a kind of lexicon or new grammar that allows us to talk to each other as opposed to the way that this clash of discourses around Islam in the West?
Thank you for the question. I think it's very difficult, you see. I mean, in the sense that there is a master discourse that defines who we are in general. If we see ourselves as Westerners or Protestant Christians or secularists or Muslims or Arabs or what have you, a lot of the meanings of that is already controlled, is already produced by this mutual intelligibility of what these things actually mean. So I think it's a harder thing to do than one thinks. It's not simply about a new vocabulary, because everything is co-optable very, very quickly, right? So if you say, and if you respond to the question, does Islam do this to women? And they say, oh no, Islam does not. You've already lost, right? Because you already speak the language of something called Islam, whatever that is. I mean, what is Islam here? Is it the Quran, for example? Is it Hadith? Is it Sunnah? Is it all three? Is it 14 centuries of Muslim existence? Is it some Islamic government? Or it is unclear to me what that means. There's an attempt to completely flatten histories, geographies, temporalities, different peoples and cultures, and I mean, at the risk of sounding also liberal, different Islams, but of course one can no longer invoke any of these things without being immediately co-opted into the meanings accrued to these words by this discourse. So it's one has to be vigilant constantly. I don't think there's no way out. There is a way out, but it's not an easy way out. The exit sign is not clearly defined, but I think a lot of work has to be done.
Hi, my name is Amid, and I'm a Palestinian student here. I have a question. I wrote it down to make sure it's suitable. So you mentioned that progress is achievable without necessarily needing to pay a price, cultural price. But we do see a common misconception in the Arab world and a wave of youth emerging to adopt Western habits and to undermine Arab culture, looking down at it as if it is indeed a medium with a high viscosity, hindering progress. What do you think contributes most to this misguidance? To what extent do you think Arab regimes and Arab education systems contribute to this? And how much does Western colonialism and new colonialism until now contribute to this phenomenon?
Thank you for your question. I didn't say that. Leonard Binder was saying that there are some Muslims, that Muslims would have to pay a price, but some believe that they don't have to pay a price. I wasn't saying either. I don't use this kind of social Darwinist language of progress and civilizations and cultures. I find it very problematic. I wrote a whole book about why it's problematic. But the thing is, I think for me, you're absolutely right. But I mean, not only Arab youth, I mean, the 20th century Arabs, I mean, of course, have been highly influenced by colonial cultures. And remember, I mean, this is not only Arabs. This applies to people around the world, right? Including inside what is now known as Europe or inside the US, right? I mean, was it not Malcolm X that said something to the effect that the biggest sin of the white man is not to think that the black man is ugly and stupid, but to actually convince black people that they are that, right? So the problem is that a lot, basically what sometimes we call عقدة الخواجة, or the complex of the West, is part of this history. It's internalized in different discourses. Arab leaders use it sometimes, and they echo Western leaders' notion that, our culture is not democratic, or our people are not prone to democracy, we need time. I mean, Omar Suleiman, the departing vice president of Egypt, said something to that effect, that we don't have parliamentary, that we need many years, decades before we could develop this. So they partake in this. They actually believe this, right? Because they've been indoctrinated in an educational system that, first of all, exoticizes the West as the place and time of democracy. And nothing can convince them otherwise, right? For example, the facts that I've just generated about US history and the present, right, do not convince them that, in fact, the US is not the democratic sort of place that its political leaders claim it to be. So they're very impressed by what they see, because everything, the discourse that actually produces these meanings controls every aspect of our lives, whether it's, again, our educational systems, the political culture, the media. But it's not, I don't know what Western culture means. It's a specific culture produced by a certain class of culture makers in certain European, or mostly in the US, but some European countries that generate whatever this culture is. Remember, I mean, it's not that, you know, Bulgarians or Romanians or the French have had Mozart, right? But they now suddenly they appropriate Mozart. Somehow, you know, an Austrian becomes the property of a small town, a small village inhabitant in Estonia, and Bulgaria, or even Greece for that matter, because of this conception that this is something called Europe, and this is European culture, where they can all appropriate Leonardo da Vinci, for example. But others cannot, right? So the idea that there, I mean, what you consider to be Western or Arab culture, they're both constructions. So I'm not interested in saving something called Arab culture, but I am interested in showing how whatever is thought of as Arab culture is thought by these youth as something lesser than what is thought of as Western culture. That is an issue that I think is pervasive, and we see this on television. We see this constantly saying, oh, you know, Westerners don't have this. When I go to Jordan often, and I grew up in Amman, I take a cab, and he tells me, see our streets? In America, they wouldn't have these kinds of streets with, you know, all these potholes. I'm like, really? I live in New York. Come and see the potholes in New York City, right? So there's, or, you know, the discourse, the social Darwinistic discourse, we are behind, we are retarded, we are, you know, all that kind, and they are advanced and progressive. I mean, listen, I mean, I haven't found that to be true in my own experience, and one's personal experience is a highly limiting thing. But looking at, you know, the situation, I find it symptomatic of culture, you know, because someone in a small town in the US or in Britain or in Canada or in New Zealand, as much as in Jamaica or Uganda or Sri Lanka, as much as in the Emirates or in Egypt or in Jordan, would hold on to these ideas because of a certain power of cultural discourse that manifests in media, in education. I don't think it's an easy thing to account. I mean, the answer to that is not to say Western culture is bad and Arab culture is good, right? That would be, you're playing into the hands of anyone who says this is good or this is bad. You're opposing this discourse in this way doesn't get you anywhere because you're implicated in the same thing. So yes, then what is culture becomes the question. How is culture formed? How did Arabness come about in the late 19th century and throughout the 20th century? Who defines Arab culture today? What are the media empires? What are the educational policies? Who are the intellectuals who speak for it? How do they speak of it? What constitutes this thing called Arab culture? These are questions that we can analyze, right, and talk about.
Without wanting to not deny that they're related in various ways, I would urge you to distinguish, on the one hand, liberalism as the dominant or a dominant theory in what you referred to at the beginning of your presentation as Anglo-American political philosophy, of which I am a practitioner, so I'm a little defensive. And on the other hand...
Tula Nikolakopoulos is the one who referred to it as such, but yes.
Right, well, but you seem to endorse that. So on the other hand, liberalism as the dominant ideology of something that we're calling now the West, an ideology associated with Western Europe and the United States. It was a surprising moment for me when you felt comfortable putting together as sort of proponents of this unified or semi-unified thing, liberalism, people as different as Martha Nussbaum on the one hand and George W. Bush on the other hand. Because of course, as a political tradition, as a philosophical tradition, liberalism has been just as critical of at least many of the features of liberalism as an ideology as you were today.
No, I fully agree, but I also spoke about liberal regimes. I was speaking about liberal policies of liberal regimes in power in Western Europe and in the US that presided over colonialism and slave systems and indentured service and women not having suffrage, etc., but still called themselves liberal. But also today, that they continue to speak of them in this way, that many liberal philosophers, I mean de Tocqueville did speak, he wrote the book on American democracy, did not mind slavery or what was happening to the Native Americans as he wrote, and was appalled that the Catholics were coming and might undermine American democracy. So yes, no, I agree that there's a dominant liberalism. There's a dominant understanding of this kind of liberalism from the 18th century, especially, as having certain kinds of attributes. I agree. There are all kinds of. I mean, there is no one liberalism in that sense, but there is a hegemonic one. And it's not only hegemonic intellectually or in cultural discourse, but also politically. That George Bush and Nussbaum both believe that everyone should have the right to vote, well, provided all kinds of things are taken care of beforehand. But nonetheless, so George Bush, conservative that he is, would not say, I don't believe people should not have the right to vote, or that women should not have suffrage, or and the transformation of all these things continue, right? Because suddenly now the Western sovereign liberal subject, which used to be white and property owning, suddenly now can be and is rewritten as if he or she had always been also a feminist, supports women, supports different sexual choices and identities, which until 20 years ago they did not. I mean, in the US, of course, citizenship was relegated to racial dimensions in the 40s and 50s and 60s. Then the sexual question came in the 70s, and then the so-called sexual orientation question came in the 1990s, redefining who the sovereign liberal US subject may be in relation to the rest of the world. And then whatever that is, whatever a ruling upper middle class, white, Protestant, rich families in the US think should be the norm, becomes the norm through institutions like NGOs, through the United Nations as a major instrument. Suddenly all these things, we have major campaigns, for example, against a so-called Arab or Muslim crime such as honor crimes, to stop honor crimes across the Arab or Muslim world. The largest percentage of honor crimes is committed in Jordan. It's about 25% of all women murdered are murdered under this Orientalist category created by Westerners called honor crimes. In the US, about 40 to 45% of women who are murdered by their boyfriends or husbands. We don't have special UN campaigns. There's no special television programs to save US women from their husbands. We don't, I mean, so this is the culturalization of this, and of course liberals like Oken and others jump on top of this and see it as an aberration in American culture, but as constitutive of the other, of Muslims and of Arabs. Thank you all for taking the time to come and hear me tonight.